Okay, so first of all, I know that this video is super late. I originally said that I was trying to get it out by the end of February. That didn't so much happen, and I was like, I'm definitely going to get it out by the end of March. And then I got really busy in March, and that didn't happen. So now it's April, but I am going to talk about my favorite games of 2014. That is last year. Seems like a million years ago. We'll do the top five, but before I get into it, I did want to just touch on a couple of honorable mentions. I know that we did that last year. We picked a game that we thought was kind of like something that we liked that wasn't quite in our top five. There were a lot of great games last year. I don't think it was necessarily the best year I've ever experienced, but there were a couple games that I played that didn't quite crack the top five that I just want to mention real quick because I really liked them. The first of those is Star Realms, which is a two-player deck builder that can be expanded to more than two players if you buy another core set. It's by a couple of, or it's by a team that used to work at Stoneblade Entertainment, who did Ascension, which is probably my favorite deck builder, or one of them, anyways. Sci-fi themed, very Ascension-like, and it's a really fast-playing, fun game. And I think this was just barely nudged out by a couple of other games, but really solid. And the other one I wanted to talk about that was an honorable mention is another deck builder called Valley of the Kings. Valley of the Kings really surprised me. I was like, oh, not another deck builder, and I ended up giving it a shot. It's an ancient Egypt-themed deck builder, but it's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it that you don't find in other deck building games. It has a really interesting take on it. It's all about culling your deck to score points. But the better cards do more things if they stay in your deck, so you have this kind of interesting balancing act. We did a review on this on the channel and Star Realms, so you should go check those out. But I really liked Valley of the Kings, and the only reason it's not higher is because there's one other deck building game in my top five that I played just a ton of. That's my cat. That I played a ton of this year that I think just nudges it out. And finally, before I jump into the top five, I did want to take a minute to talk about my favorite expansion to a game this year, which is something we didn't do last year, but I felt like I bought a lot of expansions for games this year, and some of them were great, some of them were kind of eh. The Seven Wonders Babel, for example, was one that I was really looking forward to, and it was okay. I liked it, but it wasn't like, amazing. But the one that really amazed me is Fleet Arctic Bounty. Fleet Arctic Bounty was just like a revelation. I bought Fleet with the expansion, and I played the base game a couple of times, and I really liked it. But the expansion adds so much to the core game. It adds an incredible amount of variability to Fleet, which is a great game. It's a tableau building game, kind of like something like Race for the Galaxy maybe, or San Juan. But it's a lot different. The rules are a lot different. It's got its own kind of systems, but Arctic Bounty adds a ton of stuff, and this is an expansion that feels like it was very intelligently designed for the game. Fleet was already a really smart game, but Arctic Bounty adds a bunch of stuff that fixes some problems in the core game that I had with sort of the fluidity of the economy, and just adds a ton of stuff, like really interesting stuff, like stuff that's thematic, like there's a tugboat card in this expansion that you can buy and launch as a boat as part of your fleet. And every turn, it doesn't catch fish, you tuck cards under it. And then at any point during the game, you can discard the tugboat and get all of those cards to your hand. And because cards in this game are boats, it's like a tugboat going out and like pulling boats back into the harbor, so you can like take advantage of them. I thought that was just like a really cool thematic card that this added. It adds a whole bunch of new licenses, my favorite being the Canadian DFO, Department of Fish and Oceans. They actually steal fish, or they tax fish from other fishermen, which I think is pretty funny, but they don't catch their own fish. And it's just, you can play with this and combine elements of this with elements of the core game. And to me, whenever you can sort of take modules, like whenever expansions come with modules and you can plug those into the core game in any combination that you so choose, I really like the versatility that adds to games, and I think this is a really great example of that. And for me, it's the best expansion for a game that I owned and played this year. So Fleet Arctic Bounty. I highly recommend, if you get Fleet, get it with Arctic Bounty. You will not be disappointed. Alright, with that out of the way, all the fluff out front, let's talk about my top five games of the year. And now, these are my favorite games. They're not the best games. They're not like, I'm not trying to pass a quality judgment. They're just the ones that I happen to enjoy the most, and I'm hoping to explain why that is Whether you agree or disagree, that's totally fine. Leave a comment, but I'm going to try and justify my position as best I can. So number 5 for me was a game that was really popular and really simple, and actually kind of came out of nowhere and took a lot of people, by surprise for how much they enjoyed it, especially given that like there's no theme to it. And that's Splendor. Splendor is a really simple sort of economic engine game where you have these sweet poker chips that you're using to buy cards from a display, and those cards add to the amount of money, basically, that you have to buy more cards. And so you kind of have this ever-expanding economy of gems and chips that you are trying to reach the score limit of the game before anyone else. And there's a lot of different ways that you can build or buy these cards for your sort of player area, because not only are some cards worth points, but then the value of what you need to pay for the cards may synergize with how you're building your tableau. And the other thing is the noble tiles, which give you bonus points if you get a certain number of different colored cards, add a really nice strategy. And kind of like when the game starts, you kind of look at the board and you're like, okay, this is what I'm going after. This is what I'm going to try and achieve before anyone else. And it's really how efficient can you be? Can you be more efficient than anyone else that you're playing against? We did review it on the channel, so if you haven't checked that out, go watch that. My big critique in that review was that the game was solvable, and I still think that to a degree, that the game there is a right way to play the game, quote unquote. That's never really gone away, but despite that, I really enjoyed the game, and because the rules are so simple, you can teach this game to someone in like a minute. There are literally 4 rules to this game, like what you can do on your turn, and that's it, and how you win, basically. And so I really enjoyed Splendor. It's like the perfect example of really elegant, simple design that's really rewarding and fun to play. And I know that a lot of people enjoyed Splendor because it took home some Game of the Year awards from some very large board game websites. So that's number 5. Number 4. This is a game that I didn't see a lot of coverage of, and I wish more people had tried it because I think it's a really interesting game. And that is it's actually a failed Kickstarter that they then turned around and let people purchase because it was already in production, and that is Ortus Regni. It is a competitive card game that takes place in sort of the Middle Ages in England, and each player plays as an earl, and their sort of kingdom is represented by all these different types of cards. And what's interesting about the game is there are 15 different types of cards that do multiple different things depending on how you play them, whether you play them from your hand or whether you put them on the board. And of those 15 different cards, you build a deck before you play with 24 cards. And you can have multiples of the same card in your deck. And so there's a lot of strategy around what you're trying to go after. You can play a very intrigue-heavy strategy where you're trying to assassinate the other player's characters and steal their lands, or you can go with a very sort of noble-heavy strategy where you make a huge kingdom full of lots of castles and put nobles in all of them and field large armies. And then the interesting thing about it is that it scales really well, so you can play it with 2, which is how the base game comes. If you buy one of the expansions, it adds 2 more enough cards for 2 more players, so you can play 4 players, and that's really interesting because you get into, you can make alliances with people, and for being sort of a head-to-head card game, there's some really interesting like diplomatic elements to it. There's also like this like neutral Viking faction that like starts to show up halfway through the game, and they can sort of be controlled by other players based on how much influence you commit to trying to influence the Vikings. And so there's a lot of like subtle nuance to the game, but it plays really fast, especially with 2 players. It plays a little longer with 4, but it's a really interesting game. It's got a lot of interesting mechanics. There's no text on any of the cards. If you watch the unboxing video I did, you can see that it's just like a beautifully produced game, lots of amazing art pulled from history, and it's just really interesting. And everyone I've taught to play it has had a good time. I haven't played it as much as I would have liked, but it's definitely a game that I want to show people and have them try, just because it is basically, I equivocate it to being a Crusader Kings card game, essentially. And the PC game Crusader Kings 2 specifically, but it's got kind of that feel, there's like a Middle Ages kind of socio-political, diplomatic, military aspect to it, but it's all condensed down into like, not a lot of different, rules, and it's very straightforward as well. So, but I believe you should be able to get it on their website if you're interested. But that was my number 4 game, mostly because I really love the idea of the game. I like how I like the aesthetic that was put into the game, and I really like some of the non-traditional card game game mechanics in the game. It was just really interesting to me, and I really like interesting outside the box stuff. That's sort of my preference. So Orders Regni, number 4. Number 3, this is the deck builder I talked about, and I know that this is a very polarizing game for a lot of people. I know some people who loved this game, and I know some people who absolutely hated this game and despised it, and I really liked it, and I would say of all the games that I played that came out last year, I've played this one. It's in my top 3 for most played in terms of amount of time spent playing it, and on the whole I've had a really good time with it, and that game is Shadowrun Crossfire. I was really interested with the idea of a cooperative deck building game that had persistent elements. You'll remember that Pathfinder adventure card game was on our list for 2013 favorite games, and this game seemed to kind of be a version of that style of game, or at least I thought it was, and I got it, and I played it a ton, and I'm still playing it. I have a character that I've been playing a lot with some friends. Every Wednesday we usually play. I really enjoy it. I'm still not sure how much I enjoy it, if that makes any sense. I know that I enjoyed it a lot so far. There are some things about it that are really weird. It feels like a game that was designed by like a ton of different people, or developed by a ton of different people, and it was. And it definitely feels like that. There's some things that need to be tightened up about the design, but I like the persistent elements to your characters. I don't think the progression system is balanced quite right, and I don't think that it feels like the game scales to get harder as you get more powerful, so you never feel like you're getting ahead of the game, which I understand. It's a cooperative game, and they kind of have to make it so you don't just steamroll it every time, but there's weird implementations of those systems. It's more expensive to upgrade your character the more upgrades you put on, so it actually encourages you not to upgrade your character, which is a weird thing. But that all being said, it does provide really interesting challenges. Every round is like a puzzle that you and your team of Shadowrunners have to kind of figure out and deal with as best as you can, with some unpredictability, with some really mean event cards, which is interesting, and I love the theme. I love Shadowrun as a theme. I love the Shadowrun universe, and they did an amazing job capturing that theme with the enemies, with the items, and the factions in the game. One negative thing I will say about it is, and this is probably the biggest negative thing, the game was clearly designed for 4 separate players, and I know there are rules to sort of, if you have 2 or 3 or even 1, to change the way the rules sort of function so that you get a balanced, quote-unquote, balanced game when you're playing, but I think the game plays best with 4 people. And so if you don't have a group to play this with that is not a full 4, you will probably like it less, because it feels like it was intended to be played with 4 separate people. And I know that the times that we've had the most success and had the most fun are when we have 4 players at the table. So just keep that in mind. But I've played a ton of this game. I really like it, and even though I have some gripes with the way it's designed, I really enjoy the core rule set that's there. And I really can't wait for some expansions. I think this game could like last forever for me, just because they can add stuff, so much stuff with expansions. I mean, I can see it in my mind's eye. They can add things like, you know, a structured narrative campaign or a branching narrative campaign. Just more cards would be awesome. I mean, the game comes with a bunch of cards already, but I think just even more variety would be amazing. And yeah, and especially when it comes to the enemies, I think the enemy decks are a little too close in terms of difficulty, and so the only thing that changes when you fight enemies are the amount of money that you get, and when you get hard enemies, you're putting in the same amount of effort for not as much reward to buy new cards. So I think they could even that out a little bit, but I think it's a really interesting, again, game. I love interesting ideas, and there's a lot of interesting ideas in Shadowrun Crossfire. So that's my number 3, Shadowrun Crossfire. I'm sorry if you don't like it. I understand why people don't like it, and it doesn't rub me the wrong way like it does to some people. So that's my number 3. Number 2, and by the way, I should mention that so far no war games on the list. So I'm A, proud of myself, and B, hope that you are don't think of me as just a war game or a war game only gamer, even though it's mostly what I play. However, number 2 is a war game. It's a game that came out this year. It's a game that I was looking forward to very much. It's a game that I've played several times. I got to play it at the publisher's sort of open house weekend. And I also did an interview with the designer and creator of the system from that same event back in October. And that game is Fire in the Lake from GMT Games and designed by Volko Ruhnke. It's the latest coin game, counterinsurgency game. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the coin series. I think it's just genius, and I think it's got an amazing amount of depth and strategy, and even beyond that, it's just a real brain burner, and it makes you think not only about mechanically what's going on, but it makes you think about sort of the political situation that the game is representing, the political situation and the conflict. This one's about Vietnam. It's easily by far the most complex coin game, but at the same time, I think it has some really interesting tweaks to the formula. And I know that when people look at the coin series, they're like, well, they're all the same system and they're all the same game, and I think that on the surface, yes, they're all using the same core mechanics, but each game has a different feel to it when you play it, and Fire in the Lake by far has the biggest sort of difference in how it feels when you're playing it. It feels like a slog. The Vietnam War, especially if you're the US, I mean, it feels like you are entrenched in like this bitter jungle warfare when you're playing the game. There's a lot of like friction with the other players, which in some people may not prefer, but I really like the fact that it captures the spirit of what Vietnam was all about. And I like that all the factions behave very differently, even more so, I think, than some of the other entries in the system. I would say Fire in the Lake is probably closest to a Distant Plain, but it's even more sort of goes down that rabbit hole and explores some of the ideas that each faction does stuff completely differently. And, you know, it's almost like when you play Fire in the Lake, I've played it several times. I've played it once as the NVA, I played it once as the VC, and I have played like half a game as Arvin. And, I mean, the strategy and what they're trying to accomplish is so different every time. It's almost like you're playing a different game when you play it as a different faction. And obviously the production quality of Fire in the Lake is really amazing. I think GMT does a great job with sort of their like premium games, and coin is obviously right now their most popular system. But I can't say enough good things about it. I would, you know, Fire in the Lake, it did not disappoint me whatsoever. It added a bunch of stuff that I think you're going to see in future coin games. In fact, I know you're going to see in future coin games because I've played both Falling Skies, which is the one about Caesar's war against Gaul, and Liberty or Death, which is the one about the American Revolution. And there's a lot of stuff in Fire in the Lake that the developers of those games are kind of looking at and trying to implement. But it's a great game all around. I know that the theme may turn people off, and I know that people look at you know, historical games as being really impenetrable. And while there's a lot of complexity to the strategy of the coin series, I think mechanically it's very simple, and there's a lot to really, you know, chew on and like come to terms with when you're playing it. But it provides an experience that's like you can't get anywhere else. There's nothing like it. And it plays more like a Euro than it does a war game. And I think that's the thing that, you know, people are starting to discover, is that it plays like a very heavy Euro. You know, if you were a fan of heavy Euros from like Kanban from Vital Lacerda, or heavy Euros, you know, other types of heavy Euro games, I think coin like maybe a way to get into wargaming in a way that's sort of relatable and understandable to what you like. So Fire in the Lake, number 2. And now we get to number 1. And number 1 is a game that I was also really excited about. And it was a game that I was looking forward to it, but I didn't realize how good it was going to be. It is based on the core system of a game that is my number 2 game of all time. And it came out this year. It's from Ares Games. It's the follow-up to War of the Ring, and it's called Battle of Five Armies. And it's about the Battle of Five Armies from The Hobbit. It's a 2-player war game set in that Hobbit universe. One player plays as sort of the army of orcs and goblins marching on Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and the other player plays is the Free Peoples, or the coalition of elves, men, and dwarves who have to like defend it against them. And it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. It is one of those games, and this is like a huge compliment, and the biggest thing I can think to say about why it's so good. The rules are intuitive and easy to understand once you get a hold of them, and once you start playing, the rules just kind of fade into the background. You're never confused about the things you can do or why you would do certain things. It's just very intuitive and it makes sense. And because of that, the majority of the enjoyment of the game comes from the decisions you have to make every single turn, as both sides. And those decisions are so harsh and tough for you to make as a player. From a lot of different angles. When you're playing the Free Peoples, your main decision every turn is how many generals do you activate, because activating more generals gives the shadow player an opportunity to slow the clock down of the game. And if the Free People can make it to when that clock runs out, the number of turns basically, they'll win. And so, but if you don't activate as many generals as you could, you have less efficacy during your turn, less agency on the board. And so there's just like these really critical decisions that you have to make every single time you do anything in that game. It uses War of the Rings dice action system, so you have a handful of dice, you roll them, each face of the die represents a different action, and then in the action phase, you and your opponent each alternate using one of your dice to do something on the board. The scope of the game, so where War of the Ring was much more of a large, grand, strategic kind of game, this is a much more tactical feel, but it's amazing to me how they've taken the core rules from War of the Ring and applied it to a more tactical scope. And it actually, in my opinion, feels like the rhythm of the game is a lot smoother than it was in War of the Ring. War of the Ring, don't get me wrong, I love that game, and the fact that you can play the entirety of Lord of the Rings in a game in War of the Ring is amazing. But with the Battle of Five Armies, because the scope is a little bit more narrow, it feels like the game moves a little faster. There's some times in War of the Ring where I feel like the game just gets a little slow and a little bogged down sometimes. And in Battle of Five Armies, it's constant tension, constant action. And between that and the fact that your decisions are so tough to make, it reminds me a lot of the feeling I get when I play Twilight Struggle, which is literally like 3 hours of sheer panic. Battle of Five Armies feels like the same way. It feels like every single move you're on like the razor's thin edge of success or defeat. And it feels so good to play, and it's tense, and I really love what they did with the card system. They've kind of, in War of the Ring, you had cards that you could either use for events or use in battle, and in this they've kind of separated that out. They've got a deck of neutral cards that both players share, and those, you can use them in battle or use them for various events, usually movement or mustering troops, but then each player has their own deck of event cards that will always be good for them. And you kind of mix the two in your hand, which is interesting. And the other thing I really like about Battle of Five Armies is the combat system. They've really expanded the combat system to be strategic, a lot more strategic than War of the Ring. You've still got different unit types, and the different unit types have different abilities represented by a card that when you are in combat, you draw a hand of cards, and for each unit type you have in combat, you get that unit type's card, and you can play those cards in battle to potentially trigger that unit's special effect if you hit with that unit. And it leads to some really interesting strategic decisions, because once you use that card, it is gone for the rest of the battle. So you've got to kind of pick when you want to deploy it and try and do it when you have the best chance of hitting. And then there are certain synergies between different types of units. There's a whole terrain system where certain units have sort of terrain advantage, and you get to draw a bonus card before combat. It's just really smart. And the one thing I really love is that battles don't end after the first round. Combat can go a long time. You can go back and forth and back and forth. And there's penalties for retreating if you don't play the retreat card or withdrawal card. There's a lot of thought that was put into each element of the game to kind of spruce up the moment-to-moment gameplay, and it really shows through, and it feels like that you always are making important decisions that can determine the outcome of what's going to happen. And it's just really smart. It's a really refined design, and I think it's tough for me to say whether or not I prefer it to War of the Ring, but I'm going to say they're both so good, I don't know, but it's certainly my number one game of 2014. Battle of Five Armies is absolutely incredible. There's no reason that you shouldn't play it. Even if you don't like war games, I think there's something to like here. If you like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, the theme is really evocative and brought through the mechanics. Easily the best game of 2014 that came out, in my opinion, or I should say my favorite game of 2014, in my opinion, but I also think it may be the best. it's just really tight game, and I think they knocked it out of the park, Ares, with that release. And I'm really excited. They've got some games coming out this year as well that I'm really excited for. So, anywho, that's my rant on the best games of 2014, or I keep saying best games of 2014. My favorite games of 2014. So, agree or disagree, feel free to drop a note on the video. I read everything, because I love talking about this stuff with people. Sometimes me and my friends talk about the design in games more than we actually play them. So, there you go. That's what I got for 2014. Sorry it's so late again, but yeah, got some fun stuff coming up on the channel, hopefully sooner. Hopefully there's not such a huge gap between videos. I've got a lot of ideas for stuff, and you're going to probably see that sooner rather than later. Thank you for sticking with me, and I will see you in the next one.